All the form helpers that you've learned so far in this chapter depend on having an active record object that you can use with the helper. But sometimes you need a form or just a form field that isn't connected to an object. And in those cases, we have generic form tag helpers. Back in the chapter on CRUD, we saw how to use both the object-based text field helper and then also the generic text field tag helper. And in the same way, most of the other generic versions are going to have the same name as their counterparts, but end in underscore tag too. So for example, we have text field tag, password field tag, text area tag, and so on. But we need to take a closer look at the syntax of these because there are a couple of gotchas that I want us to watch out for. First, let's just refresh our memory what the Form 4 version looked like, where it was form for subject, and then we had the subject object that we could use with each of the helpers down the line. Now compare that with the form tag version. The main difference here is that we have to provide values for each of the field. It doesn't have an object that it uses to set those default values automatically. There are a few other differences. Notice that form tag has a different structure. We have the action that the form tag is going to submit to as the first argument, and then any options we want to pass as the second argument. You see I've got multi-part true there. That's required because we have a file field tag later on in the form. Anytime you use file field tag, you need to use multi-part true. Notice that after the do, there is no f anymore because we're not yielding up that subject so that we can work with it throughout the form. We don't have an object to work with, so we don't need to have a variable that we can work with. We've already seen text field tag. The first argument, of course, is just the name of the field, and we saw earlier when we were looking at CRUD how we could give that a special name so that HTML would nest these attributes if we wanted to. I'm just using a simple string, but we could nest them so that the parameters would be nested if we wanted to. The second argument is going to be the value of this field. That's because we don't have the object to pull that value from anymore, so now we have to tell it explicitly what it should be. So I've said for text field tag, it should be first subject. Notice that for the password field tag and the text area tag, I've sent in an empty string to hold the place and let it know it should be empty. And then after that comes the options hash. We can use the same options we were working with before. I think the rest of them are fairly straightforward until you get down to radio button tag and checkbox tag. Notice that they take as a third argument what I've called checked test. Now you're not actually going to pass in the words checked test. That's a placeholder to let you know that you need to do some kind of a computation to decide whether or not this ought to be checked or not. And the end result will be a Boolean, and the Boolean is what you'll pass in, either true or false. Is it checked or is it not checked? So for example, with checkbox tag, when the form first appears, should visible be checked or not? True or false? We don't have a value of an object to compare against to see whether it's checked or not. We have to tell it explicitly. And then last we have the select tag. And select tag has one very important difference over the select helper that we were working with earlier. And that is that the second argument that gets passed in for the choices is a string. So before we were passing in all sorts of things. We were passing in ranges and hashes and arrays. Well, now it wants a string there. So we can actually write the HTML and put in the options inside the HTML tags. But if we want the same behavior that we were working with select, we can still get that. We just have to use another method nested inside there, and that's called options for select. And I think that's the easiest way to do it. And options for select will take all those same types that we were working with before, ranges, hashes, and arrays. So we can pass in the same things. Options for select will turn it into a string, and then that can be passed on to select tag. Notice that options for select takes a second argument, and that is selected test. That determines which one of these should be selected. We have to determine that when we're building the string. It's not an option that's passed into the select tag. It has to be passed in while we're generating those options. So in the case of this example, selected test should be equal to either male or female, or nil if none of them should be selected. Now I don't want you to think that just because I've shown you these two ways of working with forms that they're mutually exclusive. You can combine the two. For example, let's suppose that we have a form for a new user. That uses the object, and we could be using form for. But it could also have a checkbox that says, also sign this user up for a promotion. And then when the form is submitted, the controller can read that checkbox parameter and execute some additional code related to the promotion, but not bother to store that parameter data with the user object. Or we could have a form that includes a pull-down menu that says, when I'm done editing this page, I would like the controller to take me over to X page when I'm done. So while it's usually true that you'll go with one or the other, it doesn't have to be that way. You can mix and match. We're going to use the text field tag and the password field tag in our application when we build a login form during the user authentication chapter. Since we just want to have a field for username and a field for password, we don't need to have an object associated with it. We can just have this generic form with two fields, submit it to the controller, and then let the controller take care of trying to find the user and log them in. So we'll actually put it into practice then. For now, let's move on and look at the date and time form tag helpers. Just like the date and time form helpers that we were looking at before, there are generic versions of the date and time that we can use here as well, but they don't follow the same pattern as the other generic tag helpers. So we need to take a closer look. For starters, they don't end in underscore tag. That can be confusing. So we have select underscore date, and that is the generic version of date underscore select. That's all it is. We flipped them around. It's a little bit confusing. Select time, select date time. We also have the ability to break those up into sections, which we didn't have before. So select year, month, and day, select hour, minute, and second. So we can have just a selector for selecting the hour if we want. Or we can have something like date time that will output all of them, just like we saw previously. The second big difference from the other generic form tag helpers is that it doesn't take the field name as the first argument. All of the ones that we looked at before, the first argument was the field name. In this case, the first argument is going to be the default date and time that we're working with. So the way we call the method is select underscore, and then whichever one we want. I've just indicated XXX, so we could have date, time, whichever one we're interested in. Then the default date time that we want to be pre-populated in the select, and then whatever options and HTML options. If we want to change the field name, then we have to do that by passing in the options. We can pass in the prefix, which by default is going to be date, or we can pass in the field name. If we're working with the year, month, day, hour, minute, or second helpers, we can actually say, you know what, I actually would like to rename that so it's not called the year, it's called the expiration. Let's take a look at a couple of examples just to make sure it's clear. So you could have select date time 2 days from now, and that would give you the date time select option tags pre-populated with a date 2 days from now. Select year would give us just the year using time now, and the prefix could be expiration. So that would turn out to be expiration year in the form name and in the parameters that were submitted. Normally, instead of expiration, it would just be called date. And then we could have select hour, 24 hours from now. Field name, I could just call it HR, in which case then it would substitute the second part of that. It would be date, and then what's in the brackets would be HR. Now I know it can be a little bit confusing because they don't follow the same pattern as the other ones did. But don't worry, because you don't use these that often. You end up using the other version of it, the object-oriented version, and not the generic version. The main use case for using the generic version would be if you were going to have something like search results that you needed to filter by date, and you only wanted to find, let's say, orders that took place between 2 dates. Well, then you could have these generic pull downs in your search field, so you could pick a date that you wanted to search between and then filter the results based on that. But in those cases, it's easy to look them back up and refresh your memory as to how to use them.